This is Sophie's Dark Season presents The Dead Famous, Episode 2, with Ronald Moger as James Montague, Jonah Richert as the voice of the press, Hazel Young as Helen Beeston and Sister Anna Patrick, and Colin Rance as Geoffrey Montague. Funerals aren't, in general, events that most people run to, especially if it's their own. But I could not get there fast enough. I'd been informed that I should arrive at the church before the actual service took place. My plan, in line with the family's wishes, was to take some discreet, respectable shots of the coffin and then to write an appropriate passage to accompany it in the paper. Nothing too complicated. It seemed a bizarre request, but Miss Moore had been an exhibitionist all her life, and this seemed, in my mind, just a logical continuation of that. The church itself remained peaceful, with the priest to conduct the ceremony outside, speaking calmly with the mourners. It seemed as if he might be out there long enough for me to take my photos and leave discreetly. I entered the church, and among the cold blandness of the Anglican surroundings, there she was, Miss Sylvia Moore. In a flash, I recalled the night at the party, the famous face in the magazine that would never be circled. It would be an eternally sore point in my collection, that one unattained picture. I paused, pondered, then I realised I can still get this. While everyone milled around outside, I unscrewed one fastener on the side of the coffin and then stopped. Slowly I began to sweat. I opened the fastener completely, and then another until the coffin was ready to open. Lifting the lid, the prize was revealed, the one that got away. I found it difficult to hold back my camera and lift her body at the same time, so I slid the coffin lid over and propped her up in the coffin so that she settled into a sitting position. Perfection. One photograph, and that was another box ticked for me. One of my 30 famous faces. As soon as the camera had clicked, somewhere a door opened and the voices started building. With no time to make things good, I let the body slump down and ran towards a vestry door, leaving the coffin lid to then slip to the floor with a bang behind me. As I ran through the vestry and then out to the rear of the church, I could hear the screams and the cries and the troubled voices of the people left behind me, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered at all because I now had my photograph. After all this time, and now that I knew it was really possible to complete my list, my life took on a new meaning, with actual and real importance, dealing with things that I could touch and were precious, not like the petty things that these people in the church were now bothering themselves with. They would never know such happiness or pride in their lives. Their lives were nothing without these feelings, and so were as good as dead anyway. Whereas my life felt entirely reborn, and the future seemed just wonderful. On my returning home, I rushed straight to the bathroom where my darkroom was set up and began the development process. As I moved the paper from tray to tray, the picture began to take form in all its glory. I would have gladly taken a deep inhalation of breath in awe at the sight, were it not for the danger of increasing my already failing breath. The years of exposure to the various chemicals had caused no end of problems to my breathing. I would be fine over a short leisurely sprint, out of a church or some such building, for example, but anything more than a few hundred yards, and I would start to wheeze and lose energy. It was a most frustrating side effect of my hobby, but one I was willing to tolerate, as the prizes most certainly outweighed any so-called negativities. After leaving the pictures to drip dry, I took a cup of tea and a moment to relax, pen in hand, and check through the 30 Famous Faces supplement. I happily took an eraser and scrubbed out the penciled crosses that had so painfully marked my failures. Opportunities lost because of death or a simple refusal on the subject's part to participate in the photograph. Now, at last, I could start again and finish this once and for all. It's a remarkable benefit of this information age that almost all details of a person can be found with the greatest of ease. I remember my father telling me at one time that his parents had rarely seen their brothers or sisters, as they had, as many did in those days, moved abroad to what were then the colonies of the British Empire. One or two of them corresponded through letters and eventually aerograms, but this soon ended. Whether this was because of the loss of novelty or due to a sheer lack of news to tell, who can say, but stop they did. When family news did emerge and it became necessary to contact these people, it was rare that they either responded in a timely manner or even that they were still at the same address. Tracking them down through the various diplomatic or administrative centres proved to be a complete nightmare, and eventually contact was lost and our connection with those family members along with it. In these advanced times, it has been made so much easier by the introduction of the internet, and although it's still in its infancy, it's made my life as a journalist much simpler. More importantly, it's also made it easier to find out the most intricate details of the lives of even the most random stranger, whether people were dead or alive, at home or abroad. As long as they'd left a small trail in their wake, they could be tracked down. I now use this wonderful trail to rejuvenate my hobby. The moment I had a free evening from work assignments, I began to draw up a plan of action that might best achieve my goal as quickly as possible, but with the minimum of error and fuss. I understood that certain aspects of my new photograph collecting method might not be understood, and therefore perhaps deemed a little unsavoury to some. It was vital that I should minimise contact with the public at large and cover my tracks as well as possible. In order to know the best approach to use in each case, I had to know where all of these people now were, irrelevant of whether they were living or not. I already knew the addresses of some of them, but of course they were still alive, and so I diverted my attention to the stars in the sky, or to be more precise, in the ground. Of the 30 names in the list, I had already attained photographs of 12. This left 18 more, of which 9 were still living, and a further 9 had passed on. I calculated that it would take up to a year or more to find the graves of these deceased persons, and, partly as my work as a journalist, I might achieve a further 2 or 3 photographs from the living over the course of that year. This would leave only 6 or 7 more. The time ahead would also give me a chance to concoct a notion on how to achieve those final photographs as well, and put a close to the project. It was all becoming very exciting, but there remained a minor consideration. How was I to open the caskets to get my photographs? As I would be operating alone, the amount of digging that I would have to carry out appeared to be the most daunting task. This, it seemed, needed research. On consulting various local authority websites and checking the regulations of England and Wales concerning the burial of dead, I discovered a number of details that I previously, through my ignorance of these matters, had no idea of. Firstly, the popular colloquialism of being 6 feet under turned out to in fact be a falsehood. The only regulations concerning the depth of a grave specified that the uppermost part of the coffin should be no more than 30 inches from the surface of the plot. There was no regulation concerning how deep it had to be in total. Secondly, it appeared that some graveyards and cemeteries were incredibly busy. I would assume this was either because they were in such glorious locations, or, transversely, because the area had become so ghastly that people were rushing to their deaths just to alleviate themselves of their miserable lives, filling the land with corpses at a fantastic rate. Whichever the case might generally be, it still results in the necessity of reusing the graves from time to time, and this is why some graves are deeper than others. The idea being that there should be enough space between the first coffin and the next inhabitant. The surface above would be to place another layer of dirt and a further coffin if the need should arise. This would still leave the optimal 30 inches between the coffin and the ground. The debunking of various urban beliefs concerning this area helped my plans immensely, for I'd feared that I had a great deal of digging ahead of me. It was, however, still perhaps more digging than one man could possibly achieve in one evening without being noticed by some bothersome passer-by. There would be noise, I would need light. It was looking more and more complicated. I wondered how others had dealt with the conundrum in the past. For 2 weeks I wrangled with the problem, and, just as I was nearing the limits of my frustration, the idea came to me in the most bizarrely opportune way. After work one evening, I'd settled down to watch a documentary about the late film star Charlie Chaplin. On this programme, they explained that, after his death, Mr. Chaplin had been laid to rest in Coursier-sur-Vevey Cemetery in Switzerland. Only a matter of weeks later, 2 Eastern European motor mechanics living in Switzerland had exhumed his body and spirited it away to their hiding place, from where they contacted the Chaplin family and disgustingly attempted to extort $600,000 from them. After a 5-week police investigation, the authorities finally caught up with the criminals and retrieved Mr. Chaplin's body from a nearby cornfield where they had buried it for possible later exhumation. The whole affair had made the danger of a copycat crime an all too realistic possibility, and to discourage further attempts of disturbing his grave, Mr. Chaplin was reburied, but this time with his grave covered over by a substantial slab of concrete. This was when it hit me. If the graves were covered somehow, I could carry out my work underneath those coverings undisturbed. I would make a lightweight set of panels from chipboard or some such material, and camouflage one side of it to fit in with the surrounding grass and earth. I would start digging as per normal from above, and then, when it became too deep, from underneath this panelling. I would be able to dig down to the coffin over the course of a few days, returning as and when I could, and leave the camouflage panels on top of the grave to hide any sign of excavation work. Of course, it would mean that most of my digging would have to be done on my hands and knees with a trowel, but any dirtied clothes would be a minor inconvenience compared to what I would achieve from the whole experience. My heart was electrified with the adrenaline of what thrills were to come. All I needed to figure out now was how to dispose of the soil from the grave. On my return to work the next day, I struggled to concentrate on the routine of my daily chores, and knew that my behaviour and any thrills related to my external endeavours would have to be stifled with a certain amount of emotional detachment. The operations ahead must be kept secret at all cost, in case of misunderstandings either from my colleagues or indeed anyone else who might stumble upon my work. I relaxed and mentally distanced myself from the world, sure that no one would appreciate what I was doing, and to be honest, I didn't really care to share it with anyone anyway.
9. Miss Elizabeth Rivers, actress. 10. Mr. Reginald Bates, comedian, poet. 11. Mr. Terence Ditton, actor.
Although the publication that employed me started out with a reasonable but local distribution, it grew at a respectable rate during my employ. I was happy to be involved with a newspaper that had such a growing reach into the world. A life bereft of purpose is one that is wasted and undeserved. I, at least, was making a difference. The early years in the office had been of relative calm, but there existed also a camaraderie that you often only find with smaller businesses. Everyone knew each other's names, whether they drank tea or coffee, and if they took sugar, and if so, how many. This, of course, did not last, and as the friendliness of the early years was to prove vital in its growing popularity, so did it quickly die, as it morphed into yet another daily newspaper, no different in this respect from any other in the newsagent's stack. I know most of the staff almost mourned this transformation, but I, for one, welcomed it. It was a constant annoyance to have people chattering and laughing while I tried to work, and the slamming of my room door didn't give them the hint that perhaps they should be working also. Thankfully, as time passed by, the less professional of the employees either moved on or were fired, and so I had the bliss of a busy yet miserable office. If people are miserable, they still find time to mope, get on with their work, hand in assignments, but chatting is not the occupation of the miserable, and so this newfound peace meant that I didn't have to continue slamming my door so much. The editor, like myself, had a policy of keeping a distance from his staff. He mostly chose to communicate any decisions through his secretary or via internal notes and memos. I considered this to be perfectly fine, as any form of monitoring, as I saw it, was an unwelcome intrusion on my work. The less contact with him, or indeed anybody else in a position of power, the better. With each growth in the paper's sales figures, so my exposure to a higher and higher level of celebrity also grew. Agents and promoters were well aware of the power of the press to make or break a new film or burgeoning acting career, and so it was perceived vital to keep us well informed, along with the right and appropriate level of access to interview opportunities come film premiere time. The passing of time also meant that I eventually knew nobody in the paper from the early days. Please don't mistake this as some sort of caring. I just prefer a certain uniformity to my life, no matter how drab the rhythm. I considered my colleagues to be efficient, unemotional drones. They knew how to work, to scribble hackneyed articles with cliched similes, and do the job they were told to do. I expected any new staff to also fit this description. This is why I did not feel, when I was inevitably assigned an assistant, that she was as much an intrusion as I might otherwise have expected her to be. Her name was Louise. Louise had studied journalism and media studies at university and had, like myself, been involved in a student magazine, albeit on the sports pages. This was enough to twist the arm of her father's best friend, our esteemed editor, to give her a break within weeks of her graduating, and so she was placed under my watchful eye to write accompanying minor articles for my section of the paper. I've never wished to be any more sociable than my life necessitates it to be. Communication with my fellow man tends to be a tiresome drain on my life force. I've found myself attending parties with the sole intent of attaining my photographs and then leaving, only to be trapped by a bore of a souse in the kitchen that usually mistakes my thin-lipped, condescending smiles and constant yawns as some sort of green light to continue yapping at me. Each word is eschewed like a pin to the bubble that might be each of my brain cells being burst over and over until I actually feel stupider by the end of the conversation, if you can refer to it as such. I thank the stars that Louise did not appear to be like this. From day one, I tried my level best to be cold and dismissive of her, but it only seemed to motivate her into trying harder. She would leave me to my work as I might have requested, if I had needed to, and only spoke when she felt it necessary. We barely exchanged a word for the first 2 months, and I could swear that it must have been a further 2 until we actually exchanged any inquiry into how each other's weekends might have been. It's not that I particularly cared about her weekend, I just felt it was the right thing to do, as she worked underneath me and provided me with excellent tea whenever I might have needed it. She was motivated towards her work, but was also incredibly spineless outside of this, so I could ensure she took responsibility for some of my more menial tasks, while I found time to concentrate on the more important issue of my 30 photographs. I had been trying to decide upon where and when my first subterranean photograph should be taken, and of whom. The best idea, it seemed, was to start locally, and then move on once my confidence grew. Only a few months before, a gentleman born and bred in London by the name of Reginald Bates had passed on. For those of you unfamiliar with his life, Reginald was a comedian, and when the mood took him, a respected poet. Adored by millions as a funny man, and admired by many for his eloquent verse, he had the honour of being laid to rest in the crypt of a cathedral. This spot was accompanied, in a small corner of the building above, by a plaque listing his life's endeavours. A clean, polite and kindly comedian, this reputation of course helped with his entrance to the crypt, as families the country over warmed to his homely charms. Being overly blue in your work life is unlikely to get you a cathedral-based resting place, unless you're a bishop or of some similar standing, in which case I assume it's par for the course. Despite Reginald's friendly demeanour when in the public eye, not everything is quite so clear-cut as it first might seem. Reginald had many friends in the showbiz world, but he was a renowned recluse and did not spend his earnings wildly or extravagantly. After his death, this became known and made him a target for unscrupulous miscreants. Many years before this, a fellow comedian by the name of Benny Hill passed away in similar circumstances, but was buried in a simple but respectable grave in a simple but respectable cemetery. Rumours abounded of how his last days had been spent, and word spread, false or otherwise, that Mr. Hill had died surrounded not only by heaps of jewellery, but also of millions of pounds in cash. Through a misunderstanding of modern burial practices, laws, or whatever drove the fantasies, word spread that he had also been buried with all these riches inside his coffin. Unless the cash was buried in the form of a cheque, this would have made the coffin immensely heavy and most likely impractical to organise burying, but these considerations did not deter the imaginations of the greedy. Not long after the funeral had taken place, some people took it upon themselves to investigate these rumours firsthand by digging away at the coffin in the dead of night. The cemetery keeper found himself greeted the next morning with the unwelcome sight of an excavated grave, an open coffin, and the body of Mr. Hill slumped across the grass, still wet with the morning dew. If there had been any riches within the coffin, they were long gone by now. He was promptly reburied, and security was stepped up around the cemetery for fear of a repeat excavation. Going back to Mr. Bates, Reginald Bates's family were going to take no such risks of this happening to him, and so they negotiated with the cathedral for him to have this special final resting place in the crypt, to which the clergy readily agreed, as the family were assured that the folk who worked at the cathedral had also been great fans of Mr. Bates's work. They stated, in a quite oily fashion, that they would gladly inter him in the crypt, along with accepting a small donation to the church's coffers. It seemed a small price to pay for the peace of mind. Despite all of this safe planning, I needed that photograph, and to get to the corpse of Reginald Bates I would. The construction of this task started out simply enough, but this then grew in complication as the plan formed in my head. The cathedral, like most, was thankfully ill protected, and security had barely changed since medieval times, consisting as it did of nothing more than the simplest of locks on the doors and windows. I presumed that every investigative journalist would more than likely have access to a basic lock-picking kit, and the desk drawer of Barry the Bin Man Kingsley at my office was to prove my assumptions correct. His name came from what he saw as exposing the rubbish of society in his weekly column, although, irony not being his strong point, he failed to see what trash he was himself. He reeked of stale cigarettes and the stench of sweat that can only be achieved from concentrated years of poor personal hygiene attendance. His face was red with the stressed veins that alcohol abuse obliges. In conversation, his chauvinistic blurts never went much further than describing his most recent sexual encounter in a urine-soaked alleyway. I guess these experiences of his to have been with another human being, but I never liked to presume. I made it one of my daily goals to avoid him at all costs. Barry was forever losing things, so I knew he wouldn't start seriously looking for his lock-picking kit for another few days. The rest of the things I needed, that I did not already have, had to be obtained from various hardware stores. A small yet sturdy fishing stool to stand upon to reach places just out of my reach. A torch to guide my way. A rope to lower and raise myself through windows, and, lastly, a crowbar to prise open any monumental slabs or stone markers in front of the coffin placing. The pre-planning included the checking of the cathedral's time schedule for the next few days, studying the architectural plans that were so readily available on the internet, a few time and motion studies, and I was ready to go. My heart was beating like a broken clock. I chose to translate that as meaning I was doing the right thing. The cathedral itself wasn't a great distance from my house, but the weight of the necessary items I'd have to take with me were making the journey just that little bit more arduous. My greatest concern was how to protect my camera. Although it lay in a protective bag on one side of my body, the heavy kit swinging to and fro threatened to knock into it, and the slightest touch might have resulted in a cracked lens or even just a jamming of the camera's mechanism, either of which would end my evening there and then, as I carried no spare. I'd left the house at 2 a.m. precisely, aiming to reach my destination at 2:30 a.m. I reasoned that this time would ensure the quietness of the surrounding streets, but also it seemed the optimum time to be in the cathedral itself, as anyone living in neighbouring houses would surely by now be asleep, and no religious activity or its associated preparations would be due to start for at least another 3 hours or so. I'd visited the place earlier that day, before it shut its doors for the night. I'd chosen the one day of the week when no service or celebration was planned. As a result, there were few people around to see me sneak into the vestry and quickly unscrew the arm of a window lock. From the outside, I jammed a paper clip into the gap between the window and the frame to ensure it would hold fast in case of any disturbances caused by doors opening or other changes in air pressure that would be enough for me to lever it open later on. A casual glance would give the appearance of the window being closed like any other. This was a temporary solution, but all that was required at the time. Finally, I slid a small stool over from a desk to beneath the window to aid my descent into the room when entering from the outside, and having done all this, I quickly made my leave. The difficult part was to come. There was no way that I and my kit would get through the window all in one go. The easiest solution seemed to be to first lower my camera bag into the room with a rope and a slip knot, and then to use this same rope for my kit bag. After climbing through the now open window and listening out for sounds of possible movement, I pulled the bag in after me and gently let the window rest to a close. Time was the key factor to consider. My plans for the exhumation of graves in cemeteries allowed for a certain amount of dalliance, but this was different and called for an almost military-like operation. I didn't need to be longer there than necessary. This being the case, I'd memorised the outlay of the cathedral, and I now made my way towards the crypt. As I was just getting used to the quiet of the building, the silence was somewhat rudely disturbed by the distant shuffling of feet. The glow of what appeared to be some sort of nightlight approached, glowing closer and brighter as the noise of the shuffling increased, until an old man appeared at the other end of the cathedral, apparently oblivious to my presence. Evidently, this octogenarian had taken to going on late-night strolls through the church to alleviate his insomnia. It was a disruption I hadn't planned for. Quickly, I darted under a nearby pew, dragging my gear as quietly as possible behind me. I've never been able to hold my breath for a particularly notable length of time, and as a youth, I was always wary of putting my head under water, but now seemed a good time as any to start practicing. I realised that the slightest noise, or his noticing of anything the slightest bit out of place, could completely blow my cover and end my task before it had begun. I froze as he dragged his feet past me, smoked a pathetic cigarette, and, mumbling as he passed. Suddenly, just as I thought he might go straight past me, he stopped. Had he heard me? Perhaps he could see my feet. Before I could gather my thoughts to know what evasive steps I might take, the man took an asthmatically feeble drag from his cigarette and threw its burning roach to the ground, landing right in front of my face. A footstep from him to extinguish it, and he went on his way, shuffling and mumbling back down the aisle and out of the cathedral proper towards the residential wings. I waited until he would definitely not hear my movements and pulled myself from out under the pew and continued towards the script and Reginald Bates. Opening the door was tough, but not overly difficult. The antiquated lock was simple in design, so that once the catch spring inside had been depressed, I found it to be just a matter of inserting one more pick to turn the lock before the door slowly creaked open. Reginald's resting place was at a thankfully accessible spot, just at shoulder height, with the plaque guarding the coffin sealed with a thin line of mortar. This came away easily with a few well-placed pries of the crowbar. As I cleared the space within of debris, I saw nothing but dust in the beams of the torchlight. I planned for darkness, but this was pushing its limits. I held the torch in my mouth and reached inside the space with both hands for the coffin, but found nothing. I grabbed empty space once more, and by now I was beginning to sweat, coldly, with panic. Even further still, I reached into the darkness and bringing my hands together, grasped onto something solid, but far too small and completely the wrong shape for a coffin. As I retrieved the mystery object, my confusion changed from wonder to realisation to the purest of unfathomable anger. I felt my face tighten with silent rage as I held in my hand Reginald Bates's cremation urn. As I stated earlier, his family had wanted to take no chances after the exhumation of Benny Hill, and it appeared that they had cremated their dear relative, therefore ensuring his eternal rest. I felt so angry that what little light there was seeping into the crypt turned red by the fury in my eyes. I replaced all as I had found it, made a rudimentary effort of cleaning up behind me, and returned home to a fitful night's sleep. It should have all been so much easier than this, but, as I previously said, not everything is quite so clear-cut as first might seem. Next week, James begins to perfect his grave-digging skills, and a work colleague's personal problems interfere with his plans. New episodes are released to all streaming services every Wednesday. Subscribe now to get notified on its release. All music is by Shane Ivers of Silverman Sound. The Dead Famous was written and produced by Ronald Moger. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at This Is Sophaville.